This is The Red Line, where we talk to three big geopolitical experts about one big subject shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. When President Obama left his office in 2017, he told his successor there was one area of the world that consistently kept him up at night. The spot most likely to stumble humanity into nuclear-armed conflict. And it wasn't the Estonian border with Russia. It wasn't even the DMZ that separates the two Koreas. It was the porous, heavily militarized, religiously divided border between India and Pakistan. It's a tense standoff made even worse by the fact both sides regularly skirmish, both sides like to saber rattle to gain domestic political points, and both sides have fairly large nuclear weapon stockpiles. And although we always hear about the disputed far northern areas of Kashmir being the fighting areas, these tension zones stretch all the way up and down the eastern border of Pakistan. We spend so much focus with Kashmir being the war zone, but there are so many other areas in the Pakistani border that are just as dangerous. You see, with India, it's a 400-kilometer slog through the harsh terrain if Pakistani forces were to ever attempt to try and take the Indian capital of New Delhi. But for India, it's only an 85-kilometer journey from their front lines to the outskirts of the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. Only a few hours drive. Only a few hours for Pakistan to make decisions on whether to use the nuclear weapons they have, or possibly lose the nuclear weapons they have. And it's not just this border where things are tense for Pakistan. Baluch rebels cause huge problems along the Iranian border. Terrorism pours out from Afghanistan, intensifying domestic pressures from within, and China is taking more and more control over Pakistan with each passing month. For Pakistan, there are enemies and frenemies in every single direction. So this week we take a look into Pakistan, why it was the area President Obama feared the most, how likely it would that each side would use their nuclear arsenals if war broke out, as well as the new great game being played by Beijing and Washington for the dominion of Islamabad. And to take us through all of this, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. Enemies in every direction.
So Pakistan was carved out of India's northwestern and northeastern extremities. And that basically means that Pakistan not only has mountains in the northwest, it has deserts, it has plateaus, and so in the northwest, it has the mountains, or the highest mountains in the world, the Himalayas. Then it has the Potawar Plateau, and then the lush green plains of the Punjab, which is the main province of Pakistan, the most populous and certainly the most powerful. And then, of course, further south, you have the province of Sindh, which is, and then you have the Arabian Sea. And in the west, you have Baluchistan, which constitutes 40% of Pakistan's territory. And then you have, in the northwest, you have the northwest, what was previously called the Northwest Frontier Province, and now is called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. This, of course, is post-71 Pakistan.
Ayesha Jalal is a Pakistani-American who is the Mary Richardson in the History Department at Tufts University. She has also written quite a number of fantastic books on the history of Pakistan and where the country is heading next. She joins us today.
When Pakistan was created initially in 1947, it was a country that was a little odd because it was separated by 1,000 miles of Indian territory and had two wings, one in the northwest that I've been describing, and then also in the northeast, which included what was East Bengal, and also parts of the former province of Assam, notably Sylhet district. In 71, the northeastern portion separated from Pakistan after a bitter civil war, a brutal civil war in which many innocents were massacred, and there was violence, and of course there was Indian intervention, which facilitated the creation of what is now Bangladesh. So the Pakistan that we're talking about now is in the northwest, and I just described it. It constitutes four major provinces, Punjab being the majority province with over 60% of the population. Then you have the northwest frontier, which is known, as I mentioned, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. about 14, 15%, then Sindh, and then Baluchistan.
When you look at the border of India, most of its boundaries have pretty natural borders, like the Himalayas mountains or wide rivers that separate India from Myanmar. Does Pakistan have these same sort of natural borders?
I mean, Pakistan constitutes, what is known as the Gangetic Plain. It's the largest uninterrupted alluvial plain in the world, and on which they have demarcated these political frontiers. So environmentally, the creation of Pakistan doesn't make sense insofar as there's no natural border. Of course, there's a natural border on the Himalayan side, but there isn't one on the eastern side of Pakistan, far less on the west. I mean, Pakistan has been locked in grim battle with Afghanistan ever since its creation on the border, which the Pakistanis claim, following the British colonial state, is the Durand Line, and which the Afghan governments, including the Taliban, never accepted. So there is no natural border. In fact, the northwestern terrain is very rugged, and it's impossible to draw a border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So really, this is a political settlement, not one based on natural geography.
I mean, India and Pakistan have been a very low-grade war with each other for a very long time now. What does that border look like between the two?
It's a military control line, and by which I mean that they fought over this territory, which was, Kashmir was a princely state. When the British quit India, there were about 11 British Indian provinces in which the British directly administered control. And then there were about 565 odd princely states, including Kashmir. And so Kashmir remained a bone of contention and has remained a bone of contention. And they fought a military, they initially fought one in 1947, and then a ceasefire line was eventually negotiated in January of 49 by the UN. So basically the so-called border between Pakistan and India in terms of Kashmir is a military line of control. It's now called, it was initially called ceasefire line, now it's called a line of control, a military control. So it's a very, very uncertain border. And of course, as you're probably aware, a very unstable one with constant firing that goes on, making life miserable for the poor people who live in those areas.
So obviously the divisions between these two countries are quite stark. Is there much intermingling on the borders between India and Pakistan, or is each side mostly just keeping to themselves?
You can get across the border, but the problem is that it's very hard to demarcate the border insofar as you're really cutting across tribes who live on both sides. I mean, Pakhtuns, for instance, or Pashtuns, as they are frequently called, who are the largest largest group in Afghanistan, in the majority in the western province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, as well as in Baluchistan. So they live on both sides of the border. The Baluch also live on both sides of the border with Iran. They are Baluch in Iran and they're Baluch in Pakistan.
And these Baluch people who are split between the southeastern corner of Iran and the southwestern corner of Pakistan, can you take us through who the Baluch are and why they're very important to this story?
First of all, the Baluch, Baluchistan is not a disputed area like Kashmir is between India and Pakistan since 1947. There is, of course, a real grievance in Baluchistan based on political denial and economic deprivation, predominantly a tribal area with tribal lords lording it over and basically sort of running it either in opposition to the Pakistan government, state of Pakistan, or in collaboration with it. But I think it's important to realize that for all the talk, especially marked by the diaspora, the Baluch diaspora, which is vocal and disaffected, understandably, the problem with creating a successful secessionist movement is that whilst the Baluch constitute about 50% of Baluchistan's population, another 40% live in Sindh and another 10% or odd live in Punjab. So it'll be very difficult to really create a Baluchistan not least because of the opposition that they're likely to get from the all-powerful Pakistan military. So there is an issue about the demographics. So whilst there are these provinces and areas, it doesn't mean that the majority of the people who happen to be Baluch live in these areas.
Another tribe of Pakistan spread across two countries are the Pashtuns, with the Pashtun homeland of Pashtunistan spread across the southeastern half of Afghanistan and the northwestern third of Pakistan. Can you take us through the idea of Pashtunistan?
The Pashtunistan issue has been hanging fire and has also sort of received setbacks. But I think in 1947, when it was at its height, the demand and that's one of the bases for Afghanistan's differences with Pakistan, because Afghanistan does not recognize the Durand Line and would like to sort of stretch its control over what is now the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But really, by the 70s, before the Saur revolution in Afghanistan, the situation on the ground was rather different. And the Pakistanis, of course, always believed that there was no point in the Pakhtuns forming an alliance with a landlocked Afghanistan, and they were better off being part of Pakistan. After the revolution, there was once again a surge of talk about Pashtunistan. But ironically, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the question of Pashtunistan died out. And instead, the Pakistani state supported Pakhtun militias that were fighting the Afghan government. And there were tensions of another kind in the then Northwest Frontier Province between indigenous Pakhtuns and Afghans who are also Pakhtuns. So I think that this ethnicity as a primary prism to understand Pakistan, or if for that matter India or any other country, is full of problems, and is best sort of looked at critically rather than an explanatory value of anything.
Pashtunistan obviously never managed to form an independent nation, but East Pakistan, what is now Bangladesh, did manage to separate from the rest of Pakistan. But apart from the obvious geographical advantage of having 1,500 kilometers of India separating them from the rest of Pakistan, how did they manage to pull away when Baluchistan and Pashtunistan couldn't manage it?
Well, for one thing, they were not contiguous to the majority area, to the majority province of Punjab, which is where Pakistan's army is drawn from primarily. And you had 1,000 miles of Indian territory, and you had long-standing grievances. And the Bengalis, I think it's important for your listeners to know, constituted the majority population, but the majority population was denied their right to call the shots in the state of Pakistan, which consisted before 71 of East and West. The West had the dominance because it was an institutional dominance of the army and the bureaucracy, predominantly Punjabi. And so Bengalis had some very genuine grievances, both political, economic, and of course, let me not sort of forget cultural grievances. So I think and after the 1970 elections, which interestingly enough was the first one on the basis of universal adult franchise, and was won by the Awami League led by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and the failure of the then regime, the military regime, to transfer power to the Awami League, because there was another party, namely the Pakistan People's Party, led by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who couldn't come to terms with the Awami League. That's what really led to the split. And of course, India intervened in that. And so I think it's important to recognize that short of an intervention of the kind that occurred in Bangladesh, a secessionist movement is very unlikely to succeed.
We've been through this a couple of times in previous episodes, but during the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, Pakistan was instrumental for the US, helping to smuggle arms and fighters across the Afghan border to help fight the Soviets. Why would Pakistan help the US here? What were they hoping to gain from that relationship?
Well, Pakistan and America have had a very sort of it's a contractual arrangement. They don't necessarily have the same geostrategic interests. Going back to the 50s when Pakistan joined American-backed security alliances such as CENTO. Pakistan joined them because it wanted to raise a shield of defense against India, its premier enemy. And the United States brought Pakistan in the hope of using its army to further its cause of containing communism. So it was a mutually sort of, there was a disagreement on the reasons that they came together. They both had their own interests. So Pakistan and America have had a rather sort of, unstable relationship over the years. First, in 1965, when the war between India and Pakistan broke out, Pakistan was heavily dependent at that time on American arms and ammunition. America cut off arms and ammunition because of the war, and Pakistan suffered more than India. They cut it off to both countries, but India was also dependent on Soviet arms, not to say producing its own. So that was the first sort of shock for Pakistanis who felt that America was unreliable. But then again, the Soviet invasion changed all that. But as soon as the Soviets departed, America again forgot about Pakistan, and Pakistan came back on the radar of the United States really after 9/11. So if you look at the history of the relationship, it's not surprising. Your question is, why would Pakistan do it? I think Pakistan, by the time 9/11 rolls on, at least its army is firmly in control of the defense and foreign policy of the country, and pursues its own interests, regardless of whatever arrangement they have with America. So I would say that the relationship is more operational than it is strategic.
And Pakistan has been very involved in Afghan politics ever since. So why would Pakistan be so invested in what happens in Afghanistan?
Pakistan does not want a pro-India government in Afghanistan, which would mean that it would then be sandwiched from two sides, both the Northwest and the East by India, or pro-Indian elements. And so the fear of a pincer movement has been the strategic doctrine of the Pakistan army, that it is not, first of all, it believes it's invested a great deal in Afghanistan ever since 1979 and even longer, and doesn't want a pro-Delhi government, New Delhi government. And so that's been the primary justification for their interference, which is criticized by many elements within Pakistan in Afghanistan. And I think that is the primary reason for Pakistan wanting to continue to sort of at least maintain some sort of a relationship with the Taliban. But because of that relationship, they become valuable for the US when the US doesn't want to finish off the Taliban because it can't, and then wants to negotiate with them. So when you want to negotiate with a group like the Taliban, then you need somebody who can actually talk to them, and that's Pakistan.
And those tensions with India are incredibly important to keep the lid on, as both India and Pakistan both possess nuclear weapons. Even incredibly rich nations like Germany and Japan don't have nuclear weapons. So how did Pakistan, who has a very low GDP, manage to get a hold of nuclear weapons?
It was to offset the calamity of 1971, i.e. the loss of East Pakistan, and to restore some degree of international stature. After you lose your majority population and one major chunk of your territory, it was seen to sort of diminish Pakistan's international posture, and one way to restore it by the then government, in this instance, it was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, a long-standing proponent of nuclearization, took the opportunity to go for a nuclear weapons program. So that was the primary justification. So what I'm trying to say is that Pakistan's reasons were much broader, but when India blasted its first bomb in 1974, then the justification was even stronger. And by 1978, 1979, arguably, Pakistan was well on its way to developing a nuclear weapon. And I would say that it was able to do so partly because of determination and the support that was given by the state, the finances, and of course, an international armaments market where purchasing parts was very easy. And I think that itself is something that the West needs to look at. And I think it's been commented upon by many analysts that it was very easy to buy various parts surreptitiously and make the bomb. I mean, the bomb the story is well known, but they acquired the weapons, the parts for this from various parts of the world. And so the armaments market was quite, it was quite accessible, is what I'm trying to say for Pakistan.
Is there any nation in particular that gave Pakistan a lot of help in this area?
China helped a great deal, let's not forget. China was a major ally, and China had its own reasons to support Pakistan because its relationship with India, as you're aware, it has its own sort of wrinkles.
During the Cold War, Pakistan was a close ally of the US against the Soviets, but these days the relationship is a lot more complicated. They are technical allies of the US, but at the same time they're very close with China, and the US conduct frequent drone strikes into Pakistan, killing civilians on a pretty regular occasion. How would you sum up the relationship between Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, and Washington?
Well, the US relationship with Pakistan really has been a relationship between the US state and the Pakistan army. The people of Pakistan have not really benefited from this, nor have the Americans been particularly concerned about what the people of Pakistan think or need. And I think that's the principal weakness. I think I've implied in my earlier responses to you that the relationship is based on mutually contradictory interests. So it's always been a difficult relationship and will continue to be so. Pakistan's an important country because of its geostrategic location. And the Americans will continue to sort of, at particular moments, try and extract the maximum advantage they can. But Pakistan is not without some cards in its hands. So it has to be negotiated. It's not going to be an easy relationship for the new Biden administration. But it's one that they're aware they need to somehow straighten out a bit in order to achieve the minimum goals that they have vis-a-vis Afghanistan. Pakistan, first of all, is the American link to the Taliban. Pakistan has played a role in whatever discussions have been taking place between the US and the Taliban. So I think Pakistan has that card. Pakistan has an army that's all powerful and very crucial. And so for operational reasons, the United States does need that sort of an institution to do its bidding when it wants it to do that. So I do think that Pakistan will continue to be important. It's possible that they decide that they can just sort of work with India, but I think that will be a peril more than anything else.
One of the big strategic weaknesses Pakistan has is the country's reliance on the Indus River, which at some points is only 70 kilometers away from the Indian front line. They rely on this river for water, food, transport, and many other things. So I want to know, how important is the Indus River to Pakistan, and is there a risk of it being used as a weakness against the country?
Well, it's the lifeblood of Pakistan. So I think it's a vital element. Pakistan's predominantly still, depends on agriculture. I think the future, in terms of strategic interests, Pakistan's water scarcity. Pakistan's a lower riparian in India. Well, that's the other factor. People typically see India-Pakistan through the religious prism, which is false, but primarily, and not through the sort of strategic issues that are presented by the fact that India is the upper riparian, controls the water, and Pakistan is extremely worried about being dried out. And if India shuts the water, that would be war, effectively. So I think that it is the lifeline. It's the lifeline of the people and of the country. So there's a huge role that the Indus River plays. The Indus River has been a defining feature of Pakistan's, and for that matter, the subcontinent's history as well.
And what sort of projects are India looking at to get a better strategic position on the Indus River?
There's a huge building effort going on in Kashmir, which is, of course, intended to further India's infrastructural interventions in the area and consolidate its hold over the area. And that could enable India to shut down water at its whim whenever it wants to, whenever it suits its interests. So that's a threat that hangs over Pakistan and is partly to explain the sort of nervous tension that exists between the two countries.
And if India was successful in these projects and managed to cut the water supply to Pakistan, what do you think the likely outcome would be?
Well, Well, I think it'll be war. And I mean, I mean, whatever it takes to fight that war. I mean, if you starve Pakistan of water, I think that will be an act of war. And I can't sort of tell you exactly how Pakistan will operate, but certainly China will be a factor, as indeed the Pakistan army will be. And I think that that will be seen as an act of war. And that in itself is something that one has to try and avoid, given the fact that the two countries are nuclear.
Of the many problems that surround Pakistan, India is the one the country takes most seriously, with both India and Pakistan trying to get one up on the other to make sure they have a bigger pile in case the day of war were to ever break out. Pakistan supports extremists in India, and then India responds by building dams that could be devastating to the Pakistani water supply, adding more and more fuel to this pile, hoping that it never actually lights up. But what is each side trying to achieve here? How is each one planning to get the one up on the other? And how are Pakistan's informal relationships with groups like the Taliban going to play into all of this? Well, for that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. New winds for an old sail.
Pakistan's not what folks would expect. I think the city of Lahore rivals any of the cities in South Asia. I mean, it's a city. Lahore has an incredibly sophisticated food culture. It has forts. It has a lot of history. Karachi is similar to Bombay in many ways. Pakistanis and Indians are surprised when I tell them that, but I see a lot of similarities between those two coastal cities. And Karachi is very much a melting pot of the entire country of Pakistan. Every ethnic group is represented there. And Peshawar is one of the, which is in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, is one of the most interesting cities I've been to. It still feels like a city that's on the frontier, and there's still a certain... In Peshawar and cities like Mardan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, there's still a feeling that things could go wrong. I guess it's a vibe you get, but it's well worth the visit.
Adam Weinstein is a research fellow for the Quincy Institute, focusing on Afghanistan and Pakistan. He's also a former veteran serving in Afghanistan for the United States and still regularly reports on the region. He joins us today.
The military in Pakistan does have a history of interfering with civilian politics, and there's sort of a dysfunctional relationship between the dynastic political figures in Pakistan and the military over history. Sometimes people refer to Pakistan as a hybrid regime, meaning that it is a democracy, but there's elements within Pakistan that are not democratic. So it is a very vibrant democracy. There was just in elections that proved to be an upset for the party of Prime Minister Imran Khan. But the military still has a say that is significant. It has a veto power, you could say.
When you look at a map of Pakistan, the thing that really sticks out is the fact that the majority of their major cities, whether it be Karachi or Lahore or Islamabad, are all very close to the Indian border, usually somewhere between 100 and 200 kilometers away. How does Pakistan feel about having many of their major cities so close to the Indian front lines?
I think that's a point of insecurity. I mean, I think what a lot of folks outside of South Asia don't realize is that there's constant skirmishes along the line of control, which is the disputed border that separates parts of India and Pakistan. The danger of South Asia is that you have these two nuclear armed powers that, if they miscalculate the action of the other, you can easily have a nuclear exchange because there just simply isn't that much time for either side to make a decision. And some folks would have argued that the fact that both of them are nuclear powers has prevented conflicts from becoming much larger and kept the conflicts between the military conflicts between these two countries at a smaller scale, because neither side wants it to escalate into a nuclear exchange. But on the other side of the coin, the liability or the risk that results from escalating tensions between India and Pakistan is much greater than in other parts of the world, simply because they're both nuclear armed. One of Washington's primary concerns with India and Pakistan is that a Pakistani-backed terrorist group will spark a nuclear exchange between the two countries. And when I say Pakistani-backed, it could mean that Pakistan's supporting the anti-India terrorist group, or simply turning the other cheek and allowing them to exist freely inside Pakistan's territory. So there was a 2016 terrorist attack on an Indian army base in Uri, and then there was a 2019 terrorist attack on a paramilitary convoy in Pulwama in an Indian-administered Kashmir. And these kinds of events are what ring alarm bells in Washington, because they lead to exchanges between the conventional militaries of the two countries, which can quickly get out of hand. So this is one of the reasons that Pakistan, for example, is on the FATF gray list, and the FATF is the Financial Action Task Force, and it's an intergovernment task force, essentially, that places countries that have issues with terror financing or money laundering on either a gray list or a black list. And right now Pakistan is on the gray list, and that's due partially to try to convince Pakistan to change the way it approaches these anti-India groups. But from the U.S. side, the main concern is not so much the terrorism aspect of it as what the terrorism could spark, the reaction in India it could spark, or alternatively, a miscalculation by Pakistan's side if things escalate. So, for example, in the future there could be a terrorist attack inside Indian-administered Kashmir. The Indian military responds by conventional means. The Pakistani side miscalculates and thinks that a nuclear attack is imminent and strikes first, or vice versa. That's the concern from Washington's standpoint, and that's what makes the conflict on the border between India and Pakistan so dangerous.
I want to just understand the timeframes here. Pakistan's capital, Islamabad, is only about 100 kilometers or 62 miles away from the Indian front lines. A large surprise Indian attack, unlikely as that would be, would only give Pakistani leadership a very short window of discussion here to decide what to do. The worry here being the use it or lose it mentality when it comes to their nuclear weapons. How long roughly would Pakistan have to make a decision regarding their nuclear weapons if India were to make a big push to capture Islamabad? And to put our minds at ease here, how likely do you think an Indian surprise attack on Pakistan would actually be to take place?
You might look at South Asia and say there's many priorities and many risks in South Asia, but this risk of a nuclear exchange, the consequences are so dire that it needs to be prioritized above other concerns, even though the likelihood that it would occur is low. I think that the United States has been able to play somewhat of a mediator role in the past. That ability is diminishing, and it's partly due to the adoption of what the Trump administration called the Indo-Pacific strategy, and the Biden administration appears to be continuing on that path where India is viewed as a natural partner against rising Chinese influence in both the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and also in the Indian Ocean. And the trouble with that is that the closer that the United States appears to be with India, the less effective of a mediator it can be between Pakistan and India. It won't be seen as an objective mediator. So I think that policy change in the United States has increased the risk slightly.
Staying at Washington here, obviously the war in Afghanistan is winding down. There's not nearly as many operations as there were back in 2001. So why are the Americans still so involved in Pakistan if there's not as many operations going on in the area?
Well, number one, Pakistan has over 200 million people. It's a nuclear power. It has economic potential. It has a close relationship with China. It borders Iran, India, Afghanistan. So its location in the world will always make it important to the United States. But right now, the United States still sees Pakistan as a vital partner for resolving the conflict in Afghanistan. Now, when I say vital partner, I don't necessarily mean cooperative partner, because Pakistan and the United States have different interests in Afghanistan. So from the U.S. perspective, the best case scenario for Afghanistan is that it's a relatively stable democracy, even if it has Taliban influence in the final model of its government. At least it's a democracy that's relatively stable and doesn't become a area where transnational terrorist groups can operate. From the Pakistani perspective, those priorities are a bit different. The worst case scenario in Afghanistan for Pakistan is that it becomes a country that's extremely close to or reliant on India. If Afghanistan becomes an unstable country that dissolves into civil war, that's not a good outcome for Pakistan, but it's still better than in Afghanistan that's India aligned. And if you look at the peace agreement, the leaked peace agreement that it was supposedly drafted by the Biden administration, and it's supposed to be a peace agreement between the Afghan government and the Taliban. If you look at the outline for the transitional government, they say that Afghanistan should have a non-aligned foreign policy. There's a reason for that. That's to calm the nerves of Pakistan to some degree. And there's other reasons for it as well. So right now, what the U.S. gets out of the relationship with Pakistan is that it knows that it cannot resolve the conflict in Afghanistan without the help of Pakistan. Pakistan helped bring the Taliban to the negotiating table, but they have either been unwilling or unable to exert greater control over the Taliban or extract further concessions. So, and I think the other reason that the U.S. prioritizes Pakistan is they still see Pakistan itself as a counterterrorism risk, or terrorism risk rather. And outside of Pakistan's support for the Taliban, it has been a relatively good partner on counterterrorism issues, especially with groups like Al-Qaeda. So I think the U.S. still views Pakistan as a key counterterrorism partner against groups that will continue to exist regardless of what happens in Afghanistan. And then lastly, there is an economic relationship. There are significant people-to-people ties. There is a large Pakistani diaspora in the United States. These are less important. Pakistan wishes they were more important. The advisor to Prime Minister Imran Khan, Moeed Yusuf, has gone on record several times saying that they want it to be a geoeconomic relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan rather than a geostrategic one. They want to focus on trade, not aid. They want to focus on increasing Pakistan's exports to the United States. But I think so far in Washington, the emphasis remains a security-based relationship.
The relationship between Washington and Islamabad has always been quite complicated, and I think a good example of this one is the Bin Laden Raid. The United States went into the raid not informing Pakistan under the guise that they could not trust the ISI to not give Bin Laden pre-warning. Do you think this is a symptom of the fact that Washington can only really rely on the ISI when their objectives match up, not when their objectives go against each other?
I don't even like to look at it as through trust. I wouldn't trust Pakistan. I think you have to look at, okay, where do U.S. and Pakistani interests align? And when the interests align, then you don't have to worry about trust. And when the interests don't align, well, trust is a moot point because the interests don't align. So I wouldn't go out and say that I wouldn't advise U.S. policymakers to trust Pakistan's security establishment, but I actually think that focus on duplicity versus trust and this idea that Pakistan is double dealing, I think it's a flawed way to look at the relationship. Pakistan has its own concerns. The United States has its own concerns. And when those priorities align, then Pakistan has, in the cases where those priorities have aligned, Pakistan has been a helpful partner. And when those priorities don't align, they haven't. I'm not sure that the United States can influence Pakistan's fundamental security calculations, especially as they relate to India. And so what they have to accept is that you can affect Pakistan's behavior, but you can't change the underlying calculations that shape that behavior, and just accept the limitation of U.S. influence over Pakistan, which is something that the foreign policy establishment in the United States doesn't like to do. I think the foreign policy establishment in the United States very, very much assumes that if all countries were engaged in realpolitik and were being rational, that they all have the same interests, and they don't. Trust is just not the way to look at the relationship. It's a relationship that is predicated on occasionally overlapping interests.
When they didn't tell the ISI they were coming for the Bin Laden raid, it was the worry that the ISI was far too tied in with the Taliban. What is Islamabad's relationship with the Taliban like today?
The links between the Taliban and the Pakistani state right now are weaker than they have been in the past. So generally, Washington exaggerates the amount of influence that Pakistan has over the Taliban, and Islamabad under-exaggerates or de-emphasizes this relationship, and the reality probably lands somewhere in the middle. The current leadership of the Taliban is a little bit more hardline than it was in the recent past, and so I think Pakistan has a little bit less influence over that leadership. That being said, much of the senior leadership of the Taliban lives in and around Quetta, which is in Pakistan. So when the Pakistanis say, well, we don't have control over the Taliban, the obvious answer to that is, well, what do you mean? You could definitely make their life more difficult. The question is, would that be in the interest of Pakistan? And I think Pakistan is concerned about its Afghan refugee population and its Pashtun tribal population. And I think that the majority of Pakistani Pashtuns are not supportive of the Afghan Taliban, but it's a concern that the Pakistani state has, which is that if it takes too hard of a line against the Afghan Taliban, it will come back to haunt them through alliances between the Afghan Taliban and non-state actors inside Pakistan. I don't think that Pakistan regrets its relationship with the Taliban. I think Pakistan views the Afghan Taliban as a political reality in Afghanistan that they have to contend with. I do think that there might be some sympathy within Pakistan's security establishment for the struggle that the Afghan Taliban have experienced. But it's hard to say. The majority of the Pakistani public is not sympathetic to the Afghan Taliban, but they're certainly not sympathetic to the U.S. led invasion of Afghanistan and its 20-year occupation there. So I think it's not so much regret, but Pakistan very much wants to move past this era of being viewed as a frenemy to Washington in the context of the war in Afghanistan. It wants Afghanistan to be an afterthought and for the relationship to move from geostrategic to geoeconomic, which is the terminology that their strategic comms uses. But that's a bit delusional because until Washington either leaves Afghanistan militarily or there's a political settlement, the relationship between Pakistan and Washington is going to be haunted by the relationship between Pakistan and the Taliban.
The US needs Pakistan for logistics and to help keep the lid on the situation in Afghanistan. And for a long time, the US were really the only major power putting the effort into Pakistan. But that's all changing. Another great power is now firmly entrenched in the fabric of Pakistan. With that great power now having everything from military cooperation to naval facilities to highways that could prove a lifeline for that power in the event of a large-scale war. An entire great power's Plan B strategy is reliant on Pakistan. And to talk more about that, we turn to our third guest.
Part 3. Deep Ports and Deeper Pockets.
For Pakistan, India is understood to be the existential threat. Everything is essentially constructed around the India question. And historically, that has been the case. Pakistan was, of course, even in recent decades, has effectively been dismembered in a war with India. India is understood to be the sort of blood rival in a way that no other threat, even many of the internal threats that the country has faced, have been seen as anything comparable. India isn't just the blood rival next door. It's also it also looms considerably larger in Pakistan's imagination than vice versa.
Andrew Small is a senior transatlantic fellow with the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and also holds a visiting fellowship at the Australian National University Security College in Canberra. Andrew has written a number of books on this subject and is a highly regarded expert when it comes to Beijing's influence in the region. He joins us today.
The defensive strategy is asymmetric in nature. It's essentially structured around the nuclear program. It's been the threat for some time that Pakistan can at least hold India's major cities at risk, and that it has an arsenal that's strong enough to maintain that threat, and also that there are increasingly that if there's an invasion on India's part, there is also this looming question of whether this would turn into nuclear conflict too. This has been the question around tactical nuclear weapons on the Pakistani side, which Pakistan has developed as well. But they have considerable conventional forces as well. I mean, the Pakistan is structured primarily around the army itself. It's set up to conduct land wars primarily. That's been the entire mode of thinking, and its defences are primarily directed at its eastern borders. The nuclear capabilities have only been there in a formally declared way, of course, fully since the 90s, but I mean this is a program that's been in place much longer, and that's seen to be the kind of existential defense against the existential threat.
It's only around 100 kilometers between the Indian front lines and Islamabad. So first of all, does Pakistan have any capability of defending against a very large push from India? And how far in do you think the Indians would have to push before the Pakistanis considered a nuclear retaliation?
Well, I mean, you've had in the wars in the past. I mean, particularly if you consider that arguably Pakistan's most important and prosperous region, and where actually most of the army are from, which is Punjab, is directly on the Indian border. It doesn't take much of a move across into Pakistani territory before you're in sight of Lahore. And this has happened before. I mean, you've had Indian troops in sight of Lahore airport, and I think the sense and the risk and the anxiety that's been there for people looking from the outside at Pakistan and India is that they are so flush up against each other. If there was some sort of conventional invasion, then the likelihood of escalation into nuclear territory in a way that, of course, was not the case back in the kind of full-scale wars that were fought in 1971 or 1965, the risk of it moving into that zone is extremely high. And the other piece of this, of course, though, is that with Kashmir, the attempt on Pakistan's part at points has also, and the other piece of the asymmetric strategy has been to use non-conventional forces, has been to use militant outfits and create some level of deniability around the sorts of attacks that it's undertaken, and attempts to localize this essentially to Kashmir in the past have been one of the, given that this is the territory that Pakistan would like to claim for itself in its totality, this has also been the kind of military approach that Pakistan has utilized against India for some time. So the closest, of course, that we've ever come to these conflicts have come about as a result of some of these asymmetric, non-conventional tactics that Pakistan has pursued.
We won't go too deep into the history of Kashmir because we've already covered that quite extensively in our India piece. And if you want to know the backstory, I recommend you listen to that before you go to this one. But the capture of Kashmir has been a huge objective for both sides here. But what actual strategic benefit would either side gain if they were to actually conquer their entire Kashmiri claims from the other one?
I mean, there is a question about whether this is fully understood in strategic military terms, or that this, I mean, certainly on Pakistan's part and on India's part, these are treated as kind of foundational identity, deep kind of claims that the two sides have, that I think don't necessarily verge into questions as much of the kind of specific utility that control of particular territory would have for other purposes. I mean, of course, on India's part, this does go to. I mean, if you're looking at the territory in question, and you're looking at how Kashmir in its most expansive definition, that would also include Gilgit-Baltistan, the former northern territories. If you include this too, this goes even to the question of whether Pakistan itself has a border with China. And this is one of the questions that is there for India. This is one of the sensitivities specifically about some of these activities in Gilgit-Baltistan and the Karakoram Highway itself, that from India's perspective, that there evidently would be a difference if it controlled all of that territory and effectively expanded its borders with China instead. But I think this is primarily something that runs deeper than some of these kind of strategic and tactical considerations.
Before we talk a lot more about China, I want to talk about the Pakistani western border, the one it shares with Iran. Obviously, between the two, they share Baluchistan, which the Baluch have been pushing for independence. But is the relationship between Islamabad and Tehran deeper than just keeping the lid on Baluchistan? Do they work together on a lot of these issues?
The relationship between Pakistan and Iran has a whole series of different dimensions to it. Of course, Pakistan also has a reasonable sized Shia population itself. There's the neighbors. There's a substantial history and political and security relationships and dynamics that exist between the two sides. Certainly, there is a level of focus, and has been in the past, on the specifics of what's playing out in the regions that directly border each other in Baluchistan. But it's a much wider and more expansive and richer relationship than something that can be boiled down to that. That has been, particularly some of the cross-border activities at points have been sources of real tension between the two sides. But even if you look at for instance, Chabahar and Gwadar as ports, there are potential cooperative frameworks that are in place there as well, and have been discussed between the two sides. So I think there's still different models for how this evolves. You have to, of course, look at the fact that the closest relationship that Pakistan has, despite Iran being its neighbor in the Persian Gulf, is with Saudi Arabia. And if Saudi Arabia, if Iran were to acquire a nuclear weapon, I think the expectation is that it would be Pakistan that would help the Saudis acquire the same capacities of its own. So you do have the Saudi dimension there in the background as well, and the extremely close economic and financial and political and military linkages that exist between Pakistan and the Saudis that don't exist in the same way, and has never been a relationship of the same sort between Iran and Pakistan.
Why is there such a close relationship between Islamabad and Riyadh? Apart from religion, what do these two work on together?
I mean, in a sense, there's different dimensions to this. There has been this kind of question with the Pakistani nuclear weapon as to whether it is an instrument purely of national interest, or whether it also has the quality of kind of protection for the most sensitive sites in the Islamic world as well. And this has been one of the questions at stake that again goes beyond national interest and some of the commercial dimensions and that exist between the Saudis and the Pakistanis. This would be a different kind of conception of the security role that Pakistan has played, but of course they've also provided considerable support already in conventional terms to the Saudis, in personnel and all sorts of other ways. Pakistan has a very capable military that has significant combat experience and significant prowess in ways that the Saudis arguably do not to the same extent. So the sort of heightened role that Pakistan plays in that regard. But I mean, for Pakistan, Saudi Arabia has been one of the financial lifelines as well. It's been consistently willing to provide either direct financing or oil or other means of support to Pakistan when it's been in a difficult spot, in a way that until recently, which we've started to see with China, had really not been the case on such a consistent basis. There's a kind of a fairly deep nexus between the two sides, which if we go back even to the nuclear program, there's certainly some additional support that the Saudis provided to help finance that program as well, at a point where few others, by way of external support, would have been involved in and willing to provide anything in this regard. Again, apart from in a very different way, China itself.
I think another really interesting relationship is the one between Turkey and Pakistan. Right now, Turkey is supplying quite a lot of the Pakistani Navy, and Pakistan will be building Turkish-designed ships in the next few years. How did this relationship between Ankara and Islamabad come about?
Turkey and Pakistan have maintained a relatively healthy economic relationship. Turkey plays with a number of the major actors in the region. The kind of pan-Turkic links, of course, as well, give it a say and a stake and a set of relationships in some of these places that mean that it's a voice that Pakistan and others have to take into account.
I don't think there's any relationship in the entire world that better sums up the phrase frenemy than the one between Washington and Islamabad. There are frequent drone strikes from Washington into Pakistan. Washington doesn't trust Pakistan on everything, and at the same time, Pakistan is becoming more and more closely tied with Beijing, one of the principal enemies for Washington in the area. How would you sum up the relationship between Washington and Pakistan?
The relationship has tended to be instrumentalized, particularly around what's playing out in Afghanistan. It was a different kind of quality of relationship before, when the kind of concept of Pakistan as a non-NATO ally kind of had a sense of a kind of wider strategic role that Pakistan occupied in the region. You know, the US was able to operate important, for instance, listening facilities in the country that were played a much bigger sort of role in Pakistan's economic development. And this was also during a time when, you know, India, although at points this would kind of fluctuate, there were certainly phases where India was seen as pursuing a kind of more Soviet tilt, and so Pakistan was still the country that had its, you know, close relations with the US military. Pakistan was allowed to be used as the critical supply route for Afghanistan, of course, as well, of even greater importance when the war in Afghanistan escalated. And this meant both for sort of ground routes and air routes. And then at a certain period of time, Pakistan also did allow the United States to conduct drone strikes on its territory. These were taking place with Pakistani permission in terms of the kind of the targeting locations and in many cases the targets themselves were coordinated with Pakistan. There was always this deniability, and kind of public criticism would be expressed on the Pakistani side, but in private this was something that they had allowed to happen. You then had junctures where these tensions just blew up to an incredible degree over the concerns about kind of US personnel operating at liberty seemingly in the country. The kind of tensions over the border, which at one point involved kind of a cross-border incident that saw a number of Pakistani troops killed, and then the Bin Laden raid was a kind of embodiment of that lack of trust between the two sides, and I think a sense, on the US side that there's still some deep suspicion about the fact that Bin Laden himself seemed to be being harbored by Pakistan in a comfortable location, and that was an ambiguity that was never cleared up. And on Pakistan's part, the fact that the US could kind of sweep into the country and conduct a raid of this sort caused a lot of anxiety about questions such as its nuclear arsenal, as much as anything else. And I think beyond some of that point, you've then had this sharp deterioration. The US has really been pushing Pakistan to stop the double game in Afghanistan and provide support to a peace process. The US itself had been very reluctant to pursue a peace process itself, latterly turned to pushing Pakistan to bring the Taliban to the table. The reason that we've seen the improvement actually in relations in the last couple of years, after really continued deterioration for all of these reasons, as the US was so unhappy with the role that Pakistan was playing, and in different ways Pakistan was so fed up with the US demands, is that you've started to get more of a view on Afghanistan that is consistent between the two sides. The question for the United States is going to be, what role does Pakistan play in the wider scheme of the region and the world, when the entire focus of the relationship is not the war in Afghanistan? The other dimension to this, obviously, though, is on the one hand India, and on the other hand China, where the US tilt towards India has changed the balance of the role that it plays in South Asia. It tended to have at least a more even-handed approach, and at points historically did provide certain kinds of support to Pakistan. I think the sense is now that the US, for strategic reasons, will be tilting in India's direction. And so it means that when it comes to kind of the crises in South Asia, where the United States tended to kind of play this elevated role and would work channels on both sides and things like that. Although that takes place to an extent, I think Pakistan now understands that it's not going to be the same kind of roughly even-handed role that the US had played in the past. And the US is concerned in a very different way about the role that China's been playing in Pakistan and what that's likely to amount to as well. And that's much more recent. The two sides, China and the United States, had really been able to coexist quite well. They had similar objectives in Pakistan. There were similar things they wanted to see there. It's less clear now that that's as true, and that's starting to force some more difficult choices on the Pakistanis as well.
And I think that brings us to the main crux of this story, which is China. China has been very heavily investing into Pakistan for the last few years, building up ports and roads and infrastructure in the hope that if the South China Sea were to ever be cut off, Pakistan could still be used to import goods from the south coast into the west of China. I'm very sure this relationship goes deeper than just that, but why is China so invested in Pakistan at the moment?
So you have to look at the fact that until recently, there was not understood to be a competition for influence at all with Pakistan. There may have been kind of flashes back in the 60s and things like this, but I think the sense for some time was for China, the strategic role that Pakistan plays is as a counterbalance to India, as a way of tying India down on its western borders and preventing India from being able to concentrate militarily or otherwise on the challenges that China poses. And for it to occupy that role, there are a number of kinds of support that China needs to provide. It needs Pakistan to kind of function relatively capably. It needs India to be constantly navigating these questions. It needs to have the asymmetric capability so that it's not in danger of being outright wiped out. There needs to be some level of stability between the two sides at the same point. But that kind of the view that says that there is an advantage in having a kind of roughly stable, roughly secure Pakistan that is economically prosperous and that is able to occupy a sort of solid role in looking out for various interests in the region, that's not been inconsistent with US interests as well. There have been points going back in time where the Chinese actively wanted the United States to provide military equipment to the Pakistanis because they wanted them to have more capable forces to be able to occupy this role vis-a-vis India. And also at points, Pakistan had operated as a conduit for advanced technologies from the United States to China itself. So China's not operated on the basis that a good US-Pakistan relationship is necessarily problematic. In many ways, it's been advantageous. It strengthens Pakistan in all sorts of ways. It reduces the willingness on the US part to maintain this kind of tilt in India's direction. And it also provides cover for the China-Pakistan relationship to play out in a way that doesn't get interfered with by sanctions or other forms of pressure. In the 90s, when the relationship between the United States and Pakistan was more problematic, this is where you started to get the squeeze on things like missile sales, missile transfers from China to Pakistan. And some of the other technology support that they provided to the Pakistani nuclear program. So until recently, it had been the case that yes, China has already deep influence in the country, but this is something that's been able to operate in tandem with the United States. And even that the two sides have had certain similar concerns about Islamization in the country, about whether Pakistan is behaving as they would wish in Afghanistan. Some of these sorts of questions have been consistent between the two sides as well. The difference in the last 2 to 3 years in particular has been that with the US shift towards thinking more expansively about the Indo-Pacific rather than the Asia-Pacific, a kind of wider conception of the strategic competition with China, and of course the role that China and Pakistan has been shifting considerably as well to take on a kind of more geo-economic quality, and simply a much more expansive quality than we'd seen in the past, when it was highly constrained to a fairly narrow set of security ties between the two sides. You've started to see the two sides rubbing up against each other in a very different way, and in a more conflictual way. This was kind of manifest most clearly when you had the sort of very strong US position of criticism directed at the China-Pakistan economic corridor, China's kind of big investment platform in the country, in a way that I think surprised both the Chinese and the Pakistanis when it happened, because for some time, again, the US side had been actively asking China to expand its economic support to Pakistan and to play a larger role in that regard, because in South Asia, unlike other areas of competition between the United States and China, the interests just do look a bit different. They are more focused on militancy and terrorism, and ensuring that Pakistan is, in the worst scenario that I don't think was necessarily a plausible one, but that Pakistan doesn't become some kind of a failed state, which was a high anxiety for the US, particularly in the late 2000s, when you had a lot of the insurgent activity taking place in Pakistan. But if you start to look at this through the prism more of naval competition, geostrategic influence, rather than the traditional questions that have been there on South Asia, then you can start to see why the two sides are operating more at odds. And again, the India dimension is important here as well, in the same way that the US has decided that it needs to kind of tilt more in India's direction, including on kind of scenarios that have involved kind of bilateral tensions between Pakistan and India. China, for its part, has seen some rationale for tilting additionally to provide kind of countervailing support to Pakistan in a way that in the past it maybe at points been more reluctant to do so, particularly in situations in which they'd seen the Pakistanis as relatively culpable for the kinds of situations that had been blowing up with India, given that it was Pakistan that was often instigating the kind of cross-border activities or attacks, whether it was Mumbai or Kargil or any of these kind of other cases that we've seen. And now this puts Pakistan in a trickier position, particularly navigating these tensions between China and the United States. And I don't think this has yet turned into something that is kind of a clear battle for influence. I think there's still a sense on Pakistan's part that they should be able to find a way in which relations between the two sides can sort of coexist in a relatively benign way, but that's just become a much trickier needle to thread. And I think with the Biden administration coming in, we're going to get a kind of a fresh round of questions about how the US really sees its relationship with China in the South Asian region. Certainly the maritime competition is there, but it's not intrinsically clear that some of the kind of continental dimensions of this, that the US is going to be at odds with China in Afghanistan or even in Pakistan itself. That I think is kind of less of a set thing. I think there are some of the people even who are kind of close to President Biden who've kind of openly suggested that this should be simply an area that's deprioritized in the wider competition between the United States and China. So we may yet see a scenario in which it's not necessarily that the two sides would cooperate, but they may not be quite as fully at odds there as was starting to look to be the case in the last couple of years.
The Karakoram Highway that stretches from western China through Pakistan to its southern coast, ending in the port of Gwadar, could be a huge lifeline for Beijing. It saves items having to go all the way around through the South China Sea and puts goods only 1,500 kilometers from western China. If war were to ever fully break out and the South China Sea were blockaded by the United States, this may be China's only lifeline. The trouble is, though, that building this highway was incredibly difficult due to having to go through the Himalaya mountains. And because they couldn't go through a certain mountain, the road is actually forced to cross into Indian-controlled territory for a few miles of the journey. With this in mind, do you think there is any risk of India calling in that claim? And is this one of the main reasons that China is not putting as much emphasis on this route as they probably should be?
So there are still questions about really how good a logistical route this actually is, partly for reasons of the question that you ask as well. If you travel up the Karakoram Highway, it's an extremely narrow corridor. It's often been shut down by landslides, natural disasters, bad weather. It's only been seasonally open anyway. So the idea that this gets transformed, even when you have an all-weather surface and all of these sorts of things on the road, the idea that this is really a kind of useful logistics corridor that can, kind of navigate the Malacca dilemma and these sorts of things, has always collided with the kind of reality of the topography of the country and the conditions that the KKH operates in. And that's even before you get to the question of Baluchistan, where the levels of insecurity and the kind of the kind of militant activities that we've seen there. I mean, it's no surprise that that's the area of road construction for the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor where you've seen the largest number of people killed. Not Chinese, but Pakistani workers there. So it's still rather difficult if you then look at the logistics of it to see this as a particularly viable route, unless you spend absolutely prodigious sums of money on tunneling and a whole series of other things that would essentially harden the route against some of the kind of natural obstacles that you have there. But in a wartime contingency as well, the capacity to cut it off is very, very obvious. It is even in the scenario in which you did have the kind of, from India's perspective, the worst case scenario in which vast sums of money were spent on hardening the route, constructing railway lines, none of which I should add is in any way being envisaged at the moment. Even in this scenario, the capacity to shut it down extremely quickly, either from non-conventional actors inside Pakistan itself or from strikes from outside, it's one of the more straightforward routes to cut down. And of course, China cares about finding additional logistical routes to bypass the Malacca Straits. It mattered a lot to China in the past as well, that it did have a kind of additional land route out from the country that could get to the Indian Ocean. It's not that this has had no significance in the kind of political and strategic imagination of the two sides, but there are simply better and more viable routes, and the scenarios in which you would need to have these are precisely the sorts of scenarios in which you could absolutely envisage what the corridor route or the KKH actually being shut down.
The other huge Chinese project at the moment is the port of Gwadar, which China has put a lot of money into. They effectively lent the Pakistanis a lot of money, and when the Pakistanis couldn't pay the debts back, China took it back in a 99-year lease, to oversimplify things. This port is very crucial for China and is the deepest seawater port in the entire world. But it's in Baluchistan, which has its own problems. To which I have two questions. One, why did China put so much money into a port in southern Pakistan? And two, if attacks on Gwadar continue, will the Chinese simply just deploy their own troops to protect it, in the thought that Pakistan may not be able to hold their own ground here?
Gwadar has had this kind of ambiguous status. Firstly, between China and Pakistan on the naval side, China pretty much, the PLA Navy pretty much has carte blanche to use Pakistani facilities when it wants to. It already has ample use of Karachi. Gwadar, even kind of a little way up the coast from Gwadar, Ormara has now become one of really the principal base actually for the Pakistani Navy. There is no question that China sees benefit in the reliable port facilities that it can expect to utilize in a crisis or in kind of any imaginable scenario. And when the PLA Navy does its assessments of kind of which port facilities in the world this might be true of, it's only really Pakistan that falls into the category where they believe this would be possible. So having a reliable set of well-functioning port facilities in the country that has been built and constructed in a way that means that it can be fully utilized in a range of contingencies. That's certainly something that that China has been keen to see. Karachi itself has in the past been blockaded by India. So there has been this kind of big move of Pakistani naval assets up the coast, mostly again to Ormara. The question for Gwadar is a sort of long-term one. If Gwadar is developed as an economic facility initially, a lot of the kind of logistics that you need for that would have potential military value in future as well. I mean, you have to bear in mind with Gwadar that it hasn't had a well-functioning electricity supply, water supply, a whole series of very basic things that you would need for the port to occupy any sort of useful role in future for port calls or otherwise. So there is still, even at this stage where the two sides will claim that this is essentially a set of investments that is economic in scope, you may well not see beyond the kind of protective military facilities that are being constructed, and there's a cantonment area, there's a protective naval task force. There are all of these things being developed for Gwadar, but it's not yet crossed a threshold where it's going to be turned into a kind of a Chinese military facility or anything like that. And the other big difference, I think, is because China has kind of regular access to all of these facilities in Pakistan and trusts the Pakistani military to the extent that it believes this is something that it would always be afforded. You haven't necessarily needed to have the kind of agreements of the sort that China has with Djibouti or something like this. You don't necessarily need a dedicated Chinese naval base or something like that. And Pakistan wouldn't want to give it to the Chinese as well. And it would be a kind of a sensitive subject if they did, including in the kind of the wider population. So I think there is still there are still reasons to believe that the ambiguity around Gwadar is something that will persist for some time. And because the Pakistani army is so capable, the Pakistani security services are more capable, it's very hard to see a scenario in which the PLA would have any good grounds for being directly involved in any of these kinds of scenarios in Pakistan itself. We have, of course, seen this sort of limited role for People's Armed Police, or operating in parts of Afghanistan, around the border area. But I think not only would Pakistan be very reluctant to allow the Chinese to come in and do something like this, it's not really clear that the PLA would be better placed to take action of this sort than the Pakistanis themselves. This is not kind of terrain or operating context in which it's at all clear that the PLA has particularly good experience. If anything, it's been in recent years, there have been points in which it's been the Pakistanis training the Chinese to be better able to kind of fight under these sorts of conditions. So I would say, although there are speculations at points about Chinese troops materializing or China occupying a role, I think Pakistan is one of the places in which, if anything, this is least likely to happen. I think the places where you're more likely to see this sort of thing is where you have a country where they may have a political opportunity to do so, but also where they then don't trust the armed forces of the country to look out for their interests. And I think that's just not the case with Pakistan, whereas we've already seen in a more limited way in Afghanistan why that might be the case, or why, at least if it's not formal PLA operations, that you have kind of quasi-military actors there. I think there are other countries in which you could envisage that too, but I'd just be much more skeptical about it in the case of Pakistan. I think the one other big question, though, of course, is as Chinese assets and personnel are more involved in Pakistan, there has been a concern on India's part that you may have a greater risk of drawing China into a conflict if India holds these assets at risk, and if there are scenarios that involve Chinese personnel or significant assets hit. And so that's kind of poses some slightly different questions. But I think that would be less likely to play out in Pakistan itself as rather something where you might see different sorts of actions on India's other border.
With more of the US focus heading into Asia, and India engaging far more on the US side than ever before, will Pakistan be the new front lines of this Beijing-Washington power struggle? Or will Pakistan just sit on the back burner as India focuses more on China directly?
So Pakistan, I mean, the question of Afghanistan and some of the kind of militancy nexus in that part of the world is not going to go away. And as long as Pakistan is able to play a kind of semi-helpful or helpful enough role on that, it's still going to operate in a context in which it's geopolitically useful. People want the Afghanistan problem buried now, and they can't bury the Afghanistan problem without Pakistan playing ball. And so Pakistan does always have that kind of leverage over things, because this is not going to be a clear sort of stable settlement that you get here in Afghanistan. This is going to be extremely fragile, it's going to be volatile, and there's going to be fallout when this starts to if this in any way manifests itself again in kind of externally directed activities. But Afghanistan's been sort of so owned by the US over the last period of time that any president who withdraws forces from the country, as you know, ultimately is supposed to happen in the coming period, is going to be held partly responsible for what happens in the aftermath. So the Afghanistan dimension is not going to recede entirely, but I think it is clearly the case that the US is on a deep structural pivot away from the Middle East, the greater Middle East, terrorism as being seen as the abiding security threat. China is now seen as the abiding security threat. Great power competition in general, but China preeminently in that. And that does make for a very different map of who matters to you if you're the United States in that context. And it does privilege India, unquestionably. And I think it's no surprise that we've the first kind of proper summit meeting that takes place is with the Quad, that the first significant trips pursued by the US Secretaries of State and Defense are to the Indo-Pacific. This is going to be the pattern. It's going to be a more kind of great power focused approach that the United States takes rather than its traditional preoccupations. And that certainly means that in that wider scheme of things, Pakistan occupies not just a less important role, but also one that is highly conditioned by the significance of the Indian role to the United States in this wider scheme of things. So it's going to be a tricky spot for Pakistan. On the one hand, the big advantage they have is that they're not facing the kind of squeeze that they had from the United States in the last period of time, and that they do have some alternative sources of economic support, particularly from China, but still from some of the other sort of traditional benefactors like the Saudis too, and they were really facing a difficult set of circumstances with Washington. They were being squeezed financially. There were real concerns about the security ramifications for Pakistan if this continued to head in the direction that it was headed. So having some breathing room on that alone does make life somewhat easier. There's some chance to stabilize relations with Washington, even if they're not going to occupy a kind of privileged role there in the way that they had in the past. And they're going to have to deal with and they're making their bets on the fact that if this is the way things move, they are simply going to have to double down on the China front, which is less of a bad bet than it used to look, because the PLA's capabilities are far better than they were. So Pakistan can have higher quality kit than used to be the case in the past. The level of financing and resources that are provided are considerably better. And even on the kind of technology side, Chinese cyber capabilities, satellites, fiber optics, a whole series of these other things are now giving Pakistan scope to operate in a way that is more distinct and removed from certain dependencies on the United States that it had before. So it will be a less privileged role that Pakistan has in this new constellation, but there are nonetheless ways in which it may well, if it's able to maneuver successfully through this space, still be able to carve out a position for itself that on the issues that it actually cares about, maintaining a kind of capable, a combination of economic support and enough external resources militarily to be able to maintain its capacity to balance against India. At least on some of these fronts, it should still be able to navigate this new geopolitical context in the region and globally. But Pakistan has also shown certain proclivities at points for risk-taking and even for slightly shooting itself in the foot on this. So it remains to be seen whether it's going to be able to be sufficiently nimble to be able to pull this off. But one thing, I think, whatever bad judgment calls it's made, it still had a good sense of where power lies and how to navigate some of the great power politics. It's tended to figure out ways to come out on the right side of these things, or in ways that advantage it on the external side, even if sometimes on the internal dimensions of its policy and its handling of militancy and a whole series of these other things, it's taken a set of risks and it's taken a set of approaches that have posed as many dangers to itself as it has to anyone else.
Pakistan has few real friends in the world, only partners who seek to use Pakistan for their own reasons. And it just happens to be that occasionally those goals line up with Islamabad's as well. Iran needs Pakistan to remain stable enough to be able to keep the Baluch separatists in check. Because if they were to be able to gain a foothold in Pakistan, it would only be a matter of time before they would turn their attention to the Iranian-controlled half of Baluchistan as well. Saudi Arabia seeks to use Pakistan to keep Afghanistan destabilized, keep the US involved in the region, and also prevent Iran's reach from moving eastwards. The Pashtuns of Afghanistan never agreed with the British drawing of the maps, and hopefully seek to one day create an independent Pashtunistan, but doing so would gut the majority of Pakistan and Afghanistan as we know them today, an outcome either government would never be happy with. India seeks to try and gain as much influence as they can to try and cause headaches for the Pakistanis on their western border, as the more tense the western border gets, the more they're forced to pull resources and troops away from the Indian fronts, and deploy them to the east and north. Washington has, and still needs, Pakistan for its strategic position in the region, both for logistics and support. Without Pakistan, it would be nearly impossible to conduct their war in Afghanistan, keep tabs on Iran's eastern flank, hold on to potential for operations into Central Asia, and never be too far away from China's western province problems. But the US also doesn't fully trust Pakistan, knowing that information given to them frequently ends up being related to China and the Taliban. It's a pretty telling sign when Osama bin Laden was living in a huge compound only a few kilometers away from an ISI compound, and that the US decided not to tell Islamabad they were coming in to get him, because they knew that the ISI would pass the information on almost immediately. The US is also acutely aware of how many guns currently sit in the country, how fractured the nation is, and the huge amounts of poverty that create the powder keg extremism that Pakistan is. If the US were to abandon Pakistan, they do risk the area fracturing and the country becoming a hotbed for terrorist groups. And that is not a great outcome when the US has been conducting heavy drone strikes into Pakistan for the last few decades. China, though, seems to be the country with the most to gain here. They hope to use Pakistan to be able to bypass any blockade in the South China Sea, sell masses of Chinese goods, and house Chinese naval facilities in the Indian Ocean. They also have the added ability to use Pakistan as a lever against India, knowing that if India were to ever push toward China, Pakistan can increase tensions on their border. And with India being China's biggest Asian rival, Pakistan and India blowing themselves up in a nuclear exchange would probably end up being a net win for China. I don't think China wants that to happen, but it's a pretty big card to keep in their back pocket. Pakistan is so often overlooked by most strategists, but in all honesty, it should probably be the one we're keeping the closest eyes on. But until then, the people watching will just keep seeing both sides pour more and more fuel onto the pile. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in this week. We've been requested to do a Pakistan episode so many times, so we're glad we finally got around to this one. Last week we launched a brand new video series on our YouTube channel with a 5-minute summary of our episode on the geopolitics of rare earths. And we'll be releasing more and more of these summary episodes in the next few days. So if you've ever wanted to show someone a certain topic but can't get them to sit through a full 90-minute episode, this is a great way to get them started. And for those of you who have already checked it out, thank you for your nice comments. If you want to find out more about these videos or simply follow us to get polls, stats, maps, and quizzes, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Discord, Reddit, and Swell on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or you can follow me on Twitter with the handle MikeElliottOz. Oz is in Australia. This show would not be possible without the support of our amazing Patreons, who donate small amounts of money each week to help us keep this show going. Our Patreons get to join in on game nights, live Q&As, and get extra materials for the show. Our Patreon donations are 100% go back into the program, helping us pay for staff, programs, hosting, websites, and lawyers that are essential in running a show like this. I cannot thank our current Patreons enough for all of your support. And if you're not currently a Patreon and you feel like you can donate a few dollars a week, we would greatly appreciate it. We'll be doing our next Q&A, beers, and GeoGuessr sessions in the next few weeks. So if you are a Patreon, keep an eye on your inbox this week, as dates and times will be coming out then. A huge thank you to all of our guests this week. Ayesha Jalal is one of the most amazing people you will ever come across, and has a deep knowledge of the inner workings of the Pakistani system. It was amazing to be able to get her to take us through what is easily one of the most complicated countries in the world. Adam Weinstein has been working on the ground in the area for a long time now, and has seen many of these front lines firsthand. He is consistently putting out great material on the subject, and I highly recommend you check it out. And you can find out more details about it on his Twitter handle @AdamNoahWho. Andrew Small is one of the most respected minds on this theatre, who helps advise multiple governments around the world on what lies ahead for this highly combustible region. He's written so many good books on this subject, and I recommend you check those out as well. You can find him on Twitter with the handle @AJWSmall. As has now become a part of the show here are our 3 recommended reads for this episode, if you want to take the study of this topic even further. The first would be The China-Pakistan Axis by Andrew Small, a great book for checking out the new relationship between Beijing and Islamabad. Our second book would be Modern South Asia by Ayesha Jalal, who effectively takes us through how the web of relationships in South Asia is changing for the 21st century. And the third would be The 9 Lives of Pakistan with Declan Walsh, taking us through how the domestic politics of Pakistan radiates out into the region. These are all great reads, and links to them will be available on our website. This show would not be possible without my fantastic staff. Mark Spencer has been doing this extra voiceover work for us for quite a while now, and we couldn't be prouder to have him as part of the team. He is currently putting together a petition to get Apple to add a climate change category to the podcast section, so people can more easily find information on how climate change is affecting the world and what we can do to help. It's a great initiative, and if you want to check it out, you can find him on Twitter with the handle @ClimacticShow. Just the first of many great things Mark has coming out this year. Owen Swift has taken a huge role here at the show, acting as our producer, a writer, and researcher, as well as helping out with the website. The show is making huge steps forward, and it's mostly thanks to Owen's participation in the program. So if you want to get to know Owen and get to know behind the scenes of the Red Line, you can follow Owen on Twitter with the handle OwenA.Swift. Marissa Rafter joined our team a few weeks ago as our animator, turning these episodes into short videos. And her first video about rare earths was phenomenal. She brought a complicated topic to life and made it incredibly interesting. Marissa's background is with some of the biggest names in the industry, and it's an absolute honor to have her working for us. We are so proud to have her on board with the show. Joe Hawthorne once again did amazing work with his audio skills on this episode. He's a great guy and an amazing audio engineer. He effectively makes these shows tolerable to listen to. If you want to find him on Twitter or even hire him for yourself, you can find him on the handle @JoeHawthorne77. The last thanks goes out to you for tuning into the program. Watching this show get bigger and bigger each month has been really amazing for me. And having so many of you reach out with recommendations and articles, or even just jumping on Zoom to chat to me over a drink, has been absolutely amazing, and I really do enjoy it. I met so many great people through the show, and I really look forward to meeting even more of you. So if you ever want to just reach out, ask a question, or even just, want to follow up on an episode, please feel free to reach out to myself or my staff on the team. We'll be back in another fortnight with another international episode. But until then, thank you, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Redline podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.